Welcome again, and thank you very much for participating this webinar. This is the second public webinar that we organize on the ZDHC Wastewater Guidelines, and is such a huge. We have a lot of registration for this webinar, which is very good. So it's good that there's a lot of interest from the industry. And for those of you who just joined the webinar, we will provide this webinar presentation on the ZDHC Academy. You can register in the ZDHC Academy for free, so you can use the deck presentation for any training purposes that you have within your organization or with your supply chain partners. And if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A button instead of the chat room, and one of the panelists will answer your questions. And so we organize a series of webinars. So this is the one for European and America time zone, and we will do exactly the same for also in English for Asia time zone. So the time is a little bit more, a little bit better than for this one, the Asian company. And also we will organize one in Chinese. And I will let you know the link and also the date and the time, so you have that information as well. Okay, so just a friendly reminder to everyone here that this is a public webinar. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to put those questions in the Q&A button, but please be mindful that your questions will be visible to all the participants. So please don't disclose any confidential information you might have. All the attendees are muted to make sure that the voice from the speakers are not interrupted. And there is no video to make sure that the internet connection is as good as it could be. And as I said earlier, we have a group of panelists ready to answer any questions you have. So one of the main objectives that we organize this webinar is basically to provide an explanation or high-level information about the ZDHC Wastewater Guidelines. And this is really to support the industry, including brands, suppliers, and also laboratories to implement the guidelines. My colleague Jimmy will explain a little bit more about the annual testing and reporting schedule that we have. And the next one is going to be at the end of April. So this is really to help everybody to understand the requirements of the guidelines. How does it work? What does it mean? And so basically to make you ready to implement that in your supply chain. Just a quick introduction to the presenters and the panelists that we have today. I'm very grateful to have all of my colleagues here. So my name is Nani Trivita Kusuma. I'm a program project manager within the ZDHC Foundation. I'm the host of today's webinar, and the presenters here we have Scott Eccles, and Scott is the program director of the ZDHC Foundation, and we also have Jimmy Summers. He's the Vice President for Environmental and Sustainability Program within American NIVERD. He's going to be presenting some of the part of the webinar. He will also be one of the panelists. And we also have Phil Chung. He's a program project manager focusing on data and training from the ZDHC Foundation. He will be explaining about the Gateway platform that we have, key functionalities and also benefits. And we also have Georgia as a platform manager, and she's also part of the panelists, and she will answer especially questions related to the Gateway Wastewater Module. All right, just to let you know what we would like to cover in this webinar. It's a 1-hour webinar. In the beginning, Scott will explain in general the ZDHC Roadmap to Zero program to give you an information on how does the whole structure look like and where the wastewater guideline sits into the whole program. And then Scott will also explain about the ZDHC Wastewater Guidelines, what it is exactly, and most importantly, why it was developed. And then Jimmy Summers will give you explanation on how the guidelines work in practice, and that will include, what's the requirements for the sampling, testing, and reporting. And then we will have Phil to explain about the Gateway Wastewater Module. And then at the end, I will touch upon a couple of key next steps, practical things that brands, suppliers, and labs can do. All right, I think without further ado, I will hand it over to Scott. Here we go, Scott.
All right. Thanks, Nanny, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It's great to have so many people interested in learning about the wastewater program that we have. So as Nanny said, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'll just give you a brief background to the ZDHC Roadmap to Zero program. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it. There might be others that aren't so familiar, but I want to give everyone a background to our program, and then I'll talk about the wastewater guidelines and how they came to be, and give you an overview of those guidelines if you're not familiar with it. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So I think most people are probably aware, but if you're not, the ZDHC program really started back in 2011. There was 6 brands that came together and trying to work through these issues related to chemicals management and environmental issues with production. Really realized that you can't do this alone, and one brand can't change the industry practices. We all have to be asking for the same things and doing things in the same manner. And so out of that initial collaboration of 6 brands in 2011, we grew to about 20-some brands in 2015. We then became a foundation based in the Netherlands in 2015, and since that time we now have an executive director and a board of directors, and we have 24 brands now and over 80 contributors overall from both brands, value chain affiliates, so those are the chemical companies, chemical suppliers, material suppliers, and also the service industries to the supply chain. And then we have associate contributors who are foundations and other groups that have similar goals and objectives, but they work in maybe a slightly different space, but we want to make sure we work with them and we're coordinating our efforts. So next slide. And one thing that's important to remember about the ZDHC program is it's really it's a holistic approach. If you listen to the wastewater talk today, you'll come away with a deeper understanding of our wastewater guidelines, but that's not all there is to the program. It's designed to work in a holistic way and address the problem so that we're not just looking at wastewater, we're not just looking at the effluent, but we're actually addressing the problem at the root. And so we've organized the program around 3 main buckets of work, and that's input. So how do we change the inputs to the system? How do we keep the chemicals that are banned out of the system to begin with? And that starts with our MRSL, the manufacturing restricted substances list, and then the conformance guidance. How do you show that you're in conformance and meeting that MRSL and not using chemicals that are banned intentionally in the processes? As part of that, we have a ZDHC Gateway chemical module where suppliers can go and chemical suppliers can register and indicate the level of conformance to the MRSL that their product has, and material suppliers and dyers and finishers can go to that chemical module and they can find replacements for chemicals that are banned. So rather than just giving a list of banned chemicals, we're providing a tool so that people can actually find the better chemistries. And that's great. You can use the best chemistries, but you need to use them properly. So we recognize there's a process piece to this. We need to actually make sure that what's occurring during the processing of materials is done correctly. Part of that has to do with verification and the HIG assessment. We use the HIG assessment to look at the practices in the facilities, and then you can do a verification. And then if you need to follow up and make improvements, we have a chemical management guidance document that we've prepared that's a very in-depth guide to how to manage chemicals at a supplier, at a mill or a dye house. We also have the ZDHC Academy, so to provide training on those practices. We have the ZDHC Academy where you can go out, and we have 10 vetted providers that provide training in local languages that can get people, build their capability in the process part and how they're actually using and storing the chemicals. And then at the end is the output. And this is where people have traditionally focused at the end of the pipe, looking at products or looking at wastewater. But really, this is part of the whole program here. And what we want to do is focus on verifying that we are using the correct inputs, that they're being used correctly. And so we have the Wastewater Guidelines, and then as part of that, we have the ZDHC Gateway Wastewater Module, where brands that want to disclose with their suppliers publicly wastewater information, they can do that. Or it can also be used in a business-to-business way for suppliers to share wastewater information with the brands that they're working for. So instead of having to go out and do multiple samples for multiple brands, they could do one sample and share it with many brands. Next slide. So a little bit of overview of the work that went into and the people that worked on the wastewater area specifically. We have a similar setup in each of these areas that you saw on the previous slide. So we have a focus area around input, we have one around process, and we have one around output. And the output to date has been mostly focused on wastewater. We will be beginning to think about air emissions, which is obviously another important pathway for chemicals to get into the environment, but we've been mostly focused on wastewater to this point. We have a lab advisory group that's composed of the industry experts in laboratory analysis that are helping us with making sure that we have alignment around the methods and that we're using the proper methods for analysis when we collect samples. We have a group of probably 100 what we call interested listeners in the program, where there are people from all the brands and the contributors that are interested in what we're doing, but they aren't maybe actively participating in helping develop the tools. They are probably working on other areas of the ZDHC program, but they may not be directly involved in wastewater, but they're obviously interested in the outcome. And then the program management, myself and Danny and Phil, who you'll hear from later, we manage the program and make sure that we're moving ahead and tools are being developed, and but we're really helped by and a lot of the on the ground actual work of putting a pencil to paper and writing out these guidelines are done by, we call our co-leads or our task teams. And the people listed there, John and Herman, Angela, Jimmy, and John Stokes, they were heavily involved in developing the guidance, but also rolling out the guidance and getting it started. And they continue to be, active participants in this area. Next slide. And as a result of all that collaboration and all the hard work, just in the last year, this is a highlight, and I won't read all of them, but these are the highlights of the key developments in 2017. So back in November of 2016, we published these wastewater guidelines. And by April, we had our first 150 or so testing reports were submitted into the database from some pilot testing and other testing that was begun at the beginning of 2017. We launched webinars last year. We had a webinar back in August with quite a number of people. It was probably better suited, I think, for the Asia time zone. But we've also been developing toolkits and manuals for people to try to help people understand the guidance. So we recognize it's not enough to just put the guidance out there. We need to actually develop tools to help people understand how to use it. We've begun a lab acceptance project. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we had 67 labs that went through this process late fall last year. And we had our second testing deadline that was in October, and we've uploaded probably closer to 300 or more reports now as a result of that second sampling. The other two notable developments last year that we'll just briefly touch on today, but we've begun work on sludge and what limits should we have for sludge, and do we have any recommendations on sludge disposal as a collaborative group, and also the guidelines for leather. The wastewater guidance that is out there is really designed with the textiles in mind. Some people maybe have tried to apply it to leather, but we really wanted to do a deeper look at, are these the right limits for leather? And we're probably 60%, 70% done with that work. We came back, we got some recommendations, and now we're going out to get some more expert advice from the outside to make sure we've really landed on the correct limits for leather. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, like, why did we even care about coming up with wastewater guidelines, and how did we develop these? How did we settle on the numbers that you see in the guidance today? And I'll say that for people that maybe don't have a wastewater program at all or haven't done sampling, part of the why you would care about wastewater is it is a very visible portion of the supply chain. If you think back on most of the reports that have been published in either newspapers or magazines or online, almost all of them focus on wastewater to some degree, and it's the pictures of rivers that are red, and it's the picture of things floating in the river or foam in the river. Those are the things that really resonate with people. It's much harder to get the public's attention about something that's invisible, like 10 parts per million of a trace chemical. While those are important, the wastewater as a whole is a really visible sign of what's going on. It's also very impactful of the surrounding communities where these are produced, because in the end, it's their backyard, it's their water, it's their drinking water, it's the water that they're using for other industries. And so it is a really critical part of the whole chemicals management, that we take care of the wastewater, and that we really make sure that it's part of the process. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, we have this holistic approach, and so if we have an input control with the ZDHC MRSL, now how do we check that those, in one sense, those chemicals are not coming out in the wastewater and being used? So we can check the wastewater, we can look for those MRSL chemicals, and we can see and we can verify that if the input controls are in place, we're not detecting those chemicals in the wastewater. That's one part of it. The other part are those are kind of the invisible chemicals, the things that you wouldn't see in the water. The other part of it are these, what we call conventional parameters. And those are the things that by and large are visible. It's the foam, it's the color, it's the compounds that take up the oxygen in the water that cause, an algae bloom, which might cause the fish to die. That's another aspect of the wastewater. So you hear us talk about conventional parameters and the MRSL parameters. The conventional parameters are those things that really are controlled by the facility, and it's how they operate their wastewater treatment plant that determines typically whether they're in compliance with the conventional parameters. And a good example there is you could use something like sugar, which is completely, it's safe for human consumption, and you can put that through a plant and dump a lot of sugar into a river, and you could cause an algae bloom and take up all the oxygen and kill fish. And so, but that's something that you could control by your wastewater treatment practices and by having a functioning wastewater treatment plant that takes care of that compound in the wastewater treatment like it's supposed to. So again, there's the two parts, the conventional part and the MRSL components. We're checking for both. The MRSL is controlled by having proper input controls, and the conventional is controlled by how you operate your wastewater treatment plant. Next slide. So we published the guidelines in November 2016. You can go out to the website. You can follow the link here, or just go to the website and search for it, but it's available both in English and simplified Chinese. Next slide. So why did we decide that we wanted to publish the guidance, beyond we want to have some controls and verify? There were other guidances out there. There was guidance from AAFA a number of years ago. Business for Social Responsibility, BSR, published guidance. There was excellent guidance from Levi's, did a lot of the pioneering work on this. So there was a lot of good guidance out there, but there wasn't a single industry standard. So, there's multiple and differing national regulations. There's multiple and differing brand standards. Most of these did not cover the MRSL chemicals, which obviously is one of our focuses. There's increased public scrutiny and really a desire to enhance this environmental stewardship component of the supply chain and operations from dyeing and finishing. And it really created a lot of supplier confusion because brands were asking different things, and it wasn't clear to the suppliers, how to keep everybody happy. So we wanted to align on a single standard that, one, went beyond regulatory compliance because of these differing regulations. Not everything was covered equally in all regions. And we wanted to make sure in the end that the wastewater doesn't adversely affect the environment and the surrounding communities. And that's the bottom line here, is we want to prevent these problems. Next slide. So this is a good chart to see if your eyes are functioning properly. If you can read all the small print, you have excellent eyesight, better than I do. But this is just an example of the different regulations that were out there for COD, which is chemical oxygen demand. So that's a measure of how much oxygen will be removed from the water. And this goes back to like my sugar example. That would cause an increase in COD, which would decrease the amount of oxygen available for the fish in the water. And this is an example of there's many varying standards, and they were all at different levels. And so we wanted to get away from that and align on one standard. Next slide. So we came up with kind of some minimum requirements. I mean, it's great to have the analysis and do that, but the reality is the minimum things you need to have as a valid license to operate the plant. You need to be in compliance with your wastewater permit. In some cases, the local limit might be slightly lower than the ZDHC limit, and in the end, that's you have to be legally compliant. You should be following the generally accepted best practices for treatment and water efficiency. What that means is you're not diluting the sample at the plant to lower the concentrations, but just by using a lot more fresh water. It means that you keep the plant running. It's not turned off to say save electricity or save energy because maybe there's not much production going on. That kills the efficiency of a wastewater treatment plant by doing that. And then you need to properly dispose of the sludge. There's always sludge that is created solids that come out of this process, and those need to be disposed of properly. Those are the minimum things we need to have. Next slide. So what did we come up with for standards? So we looked at all the legal requirements globally, and you can go out to our website and find that literature review where we summarize the global requirements. We also looked at about 1,000 data points for the conventional parameters. And we looked at what was possible. And we set foundational limits, we set progressive limits, and we set aspirational limits. And the foundational were really set where about 80% of the facilities could meet those limits based on the data we had. The progressive limits were set so that about 50% were meeting those, and the aspirational were truly at the level where only 10 to 20% of the facilities were currently meeting that. But that's what we want to shoot for. We want to shoot for that aspirational limit. And then for the ZDHC MRSL parameters, really because those are chemicals we shouldn't be using, they just should not be detected. We shouldn't be picking up those chemicals in the wastewater. Next slide. So here's a quick example if you haven't looked at the wastewater guidelines, but if you take a look, it lists the chemical or the parameter on the left-hand side of your screen. Then we have limits, the foundational, progressive, and aspirational, and then the suggested test methods. Because the test methods do matter. For some of the parameters, the way the test is performed can affect the result. And even though it's a valid result for that test, you want to make sure you're using the proper test so that you can relate it back to the standards that we have. Next slide. And this is just another example of, this is for the MRSL parameters. What we did was we talked and worked with that laboratory advisory group to say, well, what is a realistic limit you can detect in wastewater from a textile facility? And so that reporting limit became the limit in the MRSL. Next slide. So here's just another way of displaying this three-level approach. And again, what we're looking for is this continuous improvement. If you're at progressive, you should be trying to get to aspirational. If you're foundational, you should be trying to get to progressive. If you're already at aspirational, there's probably things you can do to even improve that and maybe improve water efficiency. But we're aiming for continuous improvement. Next slide. And just to go back and remind people, there's the guidelines are applicable to manufacturing of fibers, the weaving and knitting, dye houses, laundries, garment washing, printing and finishing facilities. They're not applicable to the water running off of a field of cotton or where cattle are out in the field. It's not applicable to slaughterhouses. Chemical synthesis, these limits are not appropriate for where the chemicals are actually synthesized or where polymers are made. And then the tanneries, right now it's not necessarily applicable to tanneries, but that will be something that will be released later this year in an update. Next slide. Quickly on the laboratories, we've got 67 approved laboratories in 23 countries. We still need more laboratories. We have a shortage of laboratories in some areas of production, particularly in North and South America and Central America. But what we wanted to make sure was we didn't want to have just any laboratory analyzing the samples. We wanted to make sure they could actually analyze the samples with the methods that we specify and also meet the reporting limits and meet the limits. It doesn't do any good to take your sample to a laboratory only to find out that their level of analysis wasn't suitable to even tell you whether you're at the foundational level. So we want to make sure that we have laboratories that are working together to, solve problems we may have with some methods, but also increase the capacity and the capability globally. Next slide. So to that end, if people have laboratories that they work with and that they've been working with wastewater, but they haven't yet applied to the acceptance program, there's a link on the web page here where they can apply to be reviewed. And we encourage any laboratories that are interested in participating to apply. Next slide. And that's the end of my discussion of how the standard came to be and some of the details of the standard. And I'll turn it over to Jimmy Summers to talk about some of the practical aspects of, like, now that I have this standard, what do I do?
Okay, thank you, Scott. And this is Jimmy. And so that's, you've heard of background and the basis of the standard. And as Scott said, now I'm going to go through how the standard is actually being put into practice at factories. So next slide. So for wastewater discharges from wet processing facilities, there are two types of discharges. It can be broken into two different types of discharges. First is direct discharges, and the definition of those is that is when the factory, the facility has an in-house effluent treatment plant that they own and operate. And then they discharge from that in-house ETP to the environment, under a almost always under a permit. And then the other option, or the other situation, is an indirect discharge, and that is when the wet processing facility discharges to a centralized effluent treatment plant that's owned and operated by a third party, which could be a government, a local government, an industrial park, a private company, some other organization that the company might have some interest in, but it is owned and operated by a third party, not under their direct control. And in that option, the wet processing facility might or might not have pre-treatment operations for wastewater treatment at their facility. Most cases they would have some pre-treatment, but those are the two different types of discharges. So next slide. All right, so first of all, and so the way that the standard gets applied is different between for direct discharge versus indirect discharge facilities. I'll first cover direct discharges. And so this diagram shows you the different sampling points for a direct discharge facility. And I will go through each one, and there are some options and choices of how you want to, or how a facility wants to test these points in their operation. But you'll see that there's incoming water, raw wastewater, and that would be before the facility-owned effluent treatment plant. And then there's number 3, treated wastewater, which is the direct discharge going to the environment. And then there is sludge, which is number 4, and that includes primary sludge and also secondary sludge, and tertiary sludge. That includes all sludges. Okay, next slide. So specifically, to talk about how the standard is applied to a direct discharge facility and the testing requirements. For conventional parameters, and what those wastewater parameters are, what conventional parameters are, if you look at this wastewater standard, that is parameters such as biological oxygen demand, chemical oxygen demand, pH, those are generally known as conventional parameters, and you'll see a list in the standard. But for conventional parameters, treated wastewater must be tested for all the conventional parameters that are on Table 1 in the wastewater guidance, plus any additional parameters that are specified in a legal discharge permit. So if it's on your permit, and even though it's not in Table 1 of the wastewater guidance guidelines, you are required to test for that parameter. And the results are compared against the legal discharge permit, and you compare the test results also against Table 1 of the wastewater guidelines to determine which level that you meet. If there are 2 discharge points or more, the wastewater from the different outfalls should not be blended, but need to be tested separately. Okay, for the MRSL parameters, there are 2 options. You can either test option 1, which is testing the treated wastewater and the sludge. So that would be, from the previous slide, that would be numbers 3 and 4. You test the treated wastewater against the parameters in the tables that you see here in the slide. And then the sludge is tested against the sludge parameters, which, as you heard, we're still working on the reporting limits for the sludge. Or you have option 2 is to test the raw wastewater before treatment. And if you test the raw wastewater, you do either option 1 or option 2. But you test the raw wastewater against the parameters in the tables that you see there, and including the heavy metal parameters in Table 1. Now, for the incoming water sample, that sample is not tested unless there are you have results that show parameters, the MRSL parameters that show up in the samples above. And so that sample is held and is not tested unless you have those parameters show up. And then the whole purpose of that is to determine whether some of those parameters are in the raw water that you're using in your process. And so, all right, so next slide. Okay, for indirect discharges, you'll see the same diagram, and it shows you the different configuration where there might be pre-treatment at the manufacturing facility, but you see the incoming water, raw wastewater, the pre-treated wastewater, or if there is no pre-treatment, that would just be, of course, it's the raw wastewater, and then the sludge if it's available. All right, so next slide. Okay, for indirect discharges, for conventional parameters, the requirement is to treat the pre-treated wastewater, or if there's no pre-treatment, then that would just be the wastewater from the manufacturing facility. It's tested for conventional parameters on Table 1, plus any parameters that are in a legal discharge permit, or the permit that is in place between the facility and the central effluent treatment plant. The results are compared against the conventional parameters in the legal discharge permit, but there is no need to compare against the limits in Table 1 of the wastewater guidance in that case. And the facility also must provide information on the name and location of the central effluent treatment plant and the parameters and limits that are agreed on or are in place or in a contract between the facility and the receiving treatment plant. For the MRSL parameters, you'll see that there are also 2 options. And so option 1 is the pre-treated wastewater, if there is pre-treatment and sludge from that operation. That is tested against the tables that you see there, similar to the direct discharge situation. And then in option 2, testing the raw wastewater against the parameters in the tables that you see there, and heavy metals against table 1. And again, the same situation for the incoming water sample. It's held and not tested unless there are findings in the other samples. Okay, next slide. Okay. So it is very, very important, I think Scott alluded to this, that the samples are taken correctly, that they're handled correctly, and that they are representative of the discharge of the facility. I almost can't overemphasize this of how important this is. So the wastewater and the sludge samples have to be collected and preserved and shipped in accordance with ISO standards. And key points on that are that the samples, that the wastewater samples that are referred to in the previous few slides, they are to be composite samples. And there's grab samples are samples that are just taken one time at one point in time. A composite sample is a sample that is combined samples over a period of time. So the requirements under the wastewater guidelines is that these will be composite samples over no less than 6 hours, and there can be no more than 1 hour between discrete samples. So that means the minimum would be 6 samples each hour, and that composited together. The samples have to be taken by qualified laboratory personnel from one of the qualified labs, and must be taken under the factory's normal production scale or level. So, it's very important that the samples are not managed so that they're taken during times of low production or no production, or when there's heavy rainfall or some other abnormal situation going on in the production facility. Next slide. Okay, and similarly for the sludge samples need to be representative, and so if you follow the ISO guidelines on that also. So the sampling and testing frequency, as Nanny mentioned, the next report submittal deadline is April 30th. And you see that the times of the year when this is a semi-annual effort, but there also should be no less than 3 months between sampling and reporting. So, and because of the timing and the time it takes to collect samples and to arrange this, you need to factor that in to your sampling program. Now, the way that this works is, of course, only ZDHC accepted labs can submit test reports, and those are the only valid laboratories for doing this testing. Now, once a facility has testing completed, the laboratory will supply a report to the facility, and the facility will either accept or not accept the report. But the facility can only not accept it just for valid reasons. It can't be from a standpoint of the facility doesn't like the results. But if there is a disagreement or a dispute between of the results, that will be between the facility and the lab to work out. But ultimately, the facility has to accept the report if they want it published on the Gateway. But then once the facility accepts the report, then the laboratory will load the report onto the gateway, and then it can be made available to be seen by brands and others. Okay.
Thank you, Jimmy. Perfect. Yes, I think this is the end of your section. Let me check. Yes. Thank you. Great. So we have received quite a lot of questions. So keep on asking questions, and the panel will help answers. Use the Q&A button, please, not the chat room, because I saw a couple of questions in the chat room, but we will not answer those questions because we want to make it transparent for everybody. And so the next speaker is my colleague Phil, and so he's the Data and Training Program Project Manager, and he will be explaining to you about the Gateway platform on the wastewater module that we have, including key features and functionality. Here we go, Phil.
Thank you, Nani, and thank you, Scott and Jimmy. So we've heard about from Scott and Jimmy how the wastewater guidelines requirement, and as well as how you implement it in practice. Now we'd like to take a look on the key features of the ZDHC Gateway wastewater modules. And the wastewater module is a online reporting and data disclosure platform, whereby once the laboratory have sampled and tested the wastewater and sludge, they'll then upload this information onto this global platform. And this is what it looks like once you log into the system. And if you are a laboratory, you would fill in all the information about the sampling requirements, the sampling points, as well as uploading the test reports, photographs, etc. And at the same time, the supplier would also have a profile where they fill in the key vital data. For example, the factory address, contact point, and whether the factory is a direct discharger or indirect discharger. Next slide, please. So this is just to give you an idea. This is a laboratory interface where the test result is uploaded onto this system, and it's organized by analyte group, just like the wastewater guideline, as you can see. And the laboratory would fill in all the information. We are at the moment working with ADA Innovation to speed up this process by developing a offline data upload where the laboratory can fill in the information and then drag and drop the file into a system, and this will hopefully speed up the process. Next slide, please. So once the data is uploaded, and assuming that the supplier is happy and accepted the test result, the supplier will see a scorecard like this. This scorecard is available not just for the supplier themselves, but also to the brands and retailers who they work with. And as you can see on the scorecard, these vital informations are right at the top, and then you would have essentially the executive summary of your test result at the very top, at the middle section, sorry, where it breaks down to whether the factory's wastewater test result meet certain requirement, for example, foundational, progressive, and aspirational. And further down, it will provide you with a line-by-line test item and test result. And of course, you can download this as a PDF report for you to share it with your business partner. Next slide, please. You can also, as a brand, you could search the test result of your supplier on the system. You could do it by either typing in the name of the factory or the facility whom you work with onto your search bar, or you could do it by filter, for example, whether the report has been accepted and published, and also you could apply other additional advanced filters such as the country where your factory is operating in. Once you have the filter, you can actually view the test result, or you can also see the original documents, and the original documents are the lab reports submitted by testing laboratories. And of course, you can also download key data of the suppliers using the offline download buttons. Next slide, please. So the idea of the offline testing report, this is a demonstration. It's called the Clearstream report, and it is a globally accepted wastewater testing standards, a report for the globally accepted wastewater standards. It is still under development, and it will be launched in later in 2018. But on this page, it will give you a look and feel of how the report would appear. On the first page, you would have the key vitals of the suppliers, the name, the address, the contact information, etc. There will also be a map to indicate where the factory is located, as well as a score. So a score is essentially a quick piece of information of how the factory performed in relation to other similar factories. And then you would have a summary of which parameters of the parameter which you have tested, and and whether it meets certain standards, for example, foundational, progressive, or aspirational. And on the following page, there is a summary on top to show you which sampling points have been sampled and tested, and there is a line-by-line test item at the very bottom. Next page, please. So at the moment, we have over 400 test reports online, and 313 facilities have joined the ZDHC Gateway Wastewater Modules. 21 brands are supporting this initiative, and currently there are 67 laboratories that are accepted for testing the ZDHC waste, according to ZDHC Wastewater Guidelines. You can find the list of accepted laboratories on our website. You could fill in your information and download it. Next slide, please. So I believe So, sorry, is this? So on the key observation, the whole point of this system is to have an electronic data upload to minimize the reporting error. We ensure that all the reporting units are in the correct unit. For example, milligram per liter, or ppm, just make everything consistent. We also align the detection limit and reporting limit within the wastewater guideline, and this is reflected onto the wastewater gateway. So when you show one report to a brand and the same report to another brand, the brand knows that what standard you're working on, and this is the beauty of the globally harmonized standard. We also require the laboratory are trained up for sampling and testing, and we also require supplier to understand the procedure, so that when you work with a brand or other business partner, it helps you to work through some of the key issues, and you can explain to them this standard which we're working on. With the information provided in the Clearstream report and the data on the wastewater gateway, you can analyze your data and prioritize area where improvement is needed, or enhance your capability and capacity on certain areas. So, for example, let's say there are apparent issues in phthalates. Maybe the factory can work on phthalates as a priority area. So that helps you pinpoint the areas of improvement. And next slide, please.
Great, thank you, Phil. Thank you for the explanation. I realize that we are running out of time, like now 2 minutes past the scheduled time. I hope everybody will have another 3 minutes with us. I will just have like 2 or 3 slides, very, very quick. Otherwise, if you need to leave, don't worry. We will send the link to download these presentations to your email. So I will just go to the next slide for now. So this is just like a couple of practical next steps. One of the things that we want you to remember is that for now, everybody's focusing on achieving or meeting the 30th of April testing and reporting deadline. So let's focus on that. And there are a couple of things and a couple of tools and mechanisms that we provide, not only for the brands, but also for manufacturing facilities and also for the labs, to make sure that everybody feel ready to do this testing and also reporting. So if you are a brand, we would like to encourage you to start engaging the relevant teams within your company, not only the sustainability department, but also the sourcing department, production department, any department that you think is relevant that could help you implement this wastewater guidelines testing in the supply chain would be beneficial to engage. And the second thing is that start communicating to the wet processing facilities that you work with. Start socializing these guidelines to them. Use the deck, use the presentation. So exactly this presentation, spread the word to them. Organize training, but also encourage them to participate in the ZDHC webinar. And one thing that is very important is that we want to encourage you to avoid any duplication on testing, because we noticed that sometimes one supplier got asked by a couple of brands and to test exactly the same standard, which is the ZDHC guidelines, and that is the exact thing that we want to avoid in the industry. So please ask your supplier if testing has been requested or even has been done as per request of other clients that they work with. So it's very important. And if you are a manufacturing facility, we would like to encourage you to start downloading the list of ZDHC provisionally accepted labs on the website. So on the website, we have a button that you can download this list, or you can also encourage the lab that you work with, so the local lab that you work with, to apply to become a ZDHC accepted lab as soon as possible, because it will take a couple of weeks for them to go through the whole acceptance process. So if you go for these options, we want to encourage you to start the process as soon as possible. And also the link to the online form, etc., is available on this slide, which we will share with you later. And start scheduling the testing, because we noticed that there are some area that the demand is actually higher than the supply. So the request from the suppliers is higher than the available testing lab. So we want to encourage you to start scheduling testing to make sure that you achieve the end of April deadline. And if you're a supplier, you can also start making an account in the ZDHC Gateway Wastewater Module. So every supplier will have their own account, and they will manage their account. They will make sure that the information, their information is up to date. So we would also encourage you to do that. And if you are a laboratory, we want to encourage you to start applying to become a ZDHC accepted lab if you're not yet an accepted lab. And it's good to keep in mind that only the ZDHC accepted lab can access the gateway and can submit the test data on behalf of the facility. So non-accepted lab cannot have an access to the gateway, because we want to make sure that the quality of the data is comparable, and that the lab is going through the whole acceptance process and understanding what are the criteria from the ZDHC. All right, and just some of you might know this, but we will do this exact same webinar in a different time zone to accommodate colleagues who are located in Asia. So we will have in English for Asia time zone. Here you can see the date and also the link to register. If you already joined this one, you don't need to join this again, but please encourage your colleague or your supply chain partner to participate. We still have spots available. I think up until now, the registration is approximately around 200, so we still have some space. And also in Chinese, it's going to be in the beginning of March, so after the Chinese New Year, we take that into account as well. So yeah, spread the word. And as we said earlier, this webinar presentation will be available in the ZDHC Academy. Here you can see the link. Or if you cannot remember the link, it's very easy. Go to the ZDHC website and there's an Academy button right at the top. Click on it, you can register for free. Once you get into the Academy, you can go to the wastewater training video, and there we will post the deck. And please feel free to use the deck for training purposes. And then, it's also good for you to know that we have created a very short video, and it's available in YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, but also the ZDHC Academy. And we try to make it as simple as possible for people to understand, and using visuals and, to make it a little bit more uplifting, let's say. And then the last but not least, we want to say thank you to each and every one of you, and special thanks as well for the speakers today and also the panelists for the support. I saw a lot of questions that has been answered, which is perfect. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to contact us at the roadmap@zdhc.org. Any feedback, any input are welcome. All right, thank you everybody. And I'm sorry that it's a little bit over the schedule. Okay, hope to see you next time. Bye. Bye, Phil. Bye, Scott. Bye, Jimmy. Thank you. Bye, Georgia.
Bye, Nanny. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good job. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. And somebody is raising questions.